these questions are going to move from topic to topic, so you have to bear with me on that one.
Okay.
Was any thought given during your time at the Blood Policy Unit to an ex gratia payment scheme for those who infected with hepatitis B as a result of infected blood?
No.
Can we turn, please, to DHSC 003 4270? This is a letter, 4th of November 2002, to Nigel Crisp, and it's from, we see on the second page, we don't need to go to it, from Martin Gorham, and you were asked questions about this and refer to this in your witness statement. Can I draw your attention to something, the last paragraph on this page? Mr. Gorham is making complaint, effectively, about the service, if I can put it that way, that the Blood Policy Unit has provided to the NBA. He says, you've been the main link and has provided excellent support, but you've been completely overwhelmed by the amount of business that needs to be conducted, and then sets out that that's been exacerbated by a number of issues. And then it says this, and that a number of essential capital proposals are being delayed, tactical and strategic redevelopment of blood centres and the replacement of IT systems, for example. And then it goes on to say this, nor has the DOH, and if we go over the page, been able to respond in a timely fashion to policy advice we require on the future of all hepatitis C testing and on issues relating to the detection of VCJD through blood testing. And I'm asked to ask you this, can you recall what those testing technologies were and why they were being considered at that stage?
I'm afraid I can't. We had a meeting with key people from the National Blood Service, Martin Gorham, Angela Robinson and other scientists there to discuss ongoing issues and developments. And I'm aware that I think that the run-up to this letter I hadn't been to at least probably 2 of those. But I think, this letter doesn't entirely tell the full story. And I think there was a sort of, my view of it was set out in a briefing note I provided for Hazel Blears before she met Martin Gorham early the next year, because there were also things that we felt that the Blood Service should be doing that they didn't see as priorities. So I think there was a little bit of a sort of disagreement about what the priorities should be for focusing on. So we didn't entirely accept the criticism here. That's also reflected, I think, in the response that Nigel Crisp sent back to this letter. But I'm afraid, and I'm really sorry for this, I can't remember the specifics of the types of testing that Martin Gorham is referring to.
And do you know why he was suggesting that there was delay on the part of the Department of Health in responding to I think, to give policy advice?
I think that's his point in the next paragraph.
Yes, so that you've got no support. So the reason why he's saying is you've got no support, and it's made more acute by the fact the MBS is essentially a major operational service and is looking for the sort of policy and management support that other major operational bodies at arm's length nature in the NHS currently receive. I think I asked the question rather badly. What were the consequences of the delay on the testing? You may not be able to answer that if you can't remember what the testing was.
I can't, I'm afraid.
On that paragraph I've just read, what were the differences? I think. Sorry. You've said that there were differences between in view between the Department of Health and NBA on what should be prioritised. Can you recall what those differences were?
Well, very different from these issues. So, for example, we were putting a lot of pressure on the blood service to be more customer orientated in the way that they treated blood donors, allowing blood donors to make appointments, for example, which wasn't possible at this stage. People just had to turn up. So the blood service wasn't very friendly for people who had busy jobs and couldn't turn up when the blood service needed them to. And this was something that the National Audit Office had raised, that had been discussed at the Public Accounts Committee, and which we were still meeting some resistance from the blood service for. But I think, I mean, as I said, if you're happy to refer to it, the briefing I did for Hazel Blears contains, yes, I think, a good summary of where we felt we were at.
Is it, I'm not sure if this is the right document, is it DHSC 0042275_114? Is this it from you to 4th of December 2002, meeting with Mike Fogden and Martin Gorham?
Yes, it probably is. Yes, you'd need to go on to the next page at least, I think.
So if we go see the whole, so you set out the history, and then if you go to page 2, there isn't a page 2.
No.
Oh, that is the next page. Sorry. If we go over the next page. So you've set out the key areas of weakness. You say you're broadly happy underperformance with their performance, and then you set out key areas of weakness. Need to improve their service to blood donors, introduce new terms and conditions for blood donor carers, and management of the various silos within NBA.
I'm afraid this doesn't help to address the issue about the testing that Martin Gorham was referring to, but it does, I think, help to illustrate that, as ever with these things, there were two sides to the discussion about where the priorities lay.
And can we go back, please, to the previous page? Under brief history, so it says, talks about the process of reorganisation of the NBA between 93 and 2000. In the early stages, this involved rationalisation of facilities, which in some cases were poorly handled. In August 97, the Secretary of State commissioned a review of the clinical concerns raised about the service's proposals to transfer processing and testing of blood from Liverpool to Manchester. The report led to the dismissal in 1998 of the service's previous chair and chief executive because of serious concerns about the way the service had been managed. What can you tell us about that?
Prior to this, the blood service had been a regional blood transfusion services mirroring the regional health authorities. In moving to a national service, they needed to close some centres, and they made a decision to close a centre in Liverpool and move their operations to Manchester, but they mismanaged the local politics around that, which became a major issue, and that's why the Secretary of State decided in the end to dismiss the chair. So at the point where I joined the blood team, the blood service still had a lot of work to do to turn itself into a proper national body, and also to the main concern at that point from the Secretary of State was just supply of blood. We still had shortages of blood through the winter, So it was a major issue for ministers given winter pressures on the health service. So our big push initially was to sort out the blood transfusion service and to make sure that it was delivering what the NHS needed. We also at that time introduced the first TV advertising for blood, which helped a great deal. So that was in my first year.
I asked you questions this morning about when you would escalate a submission to a minister, a decision to a minister, and you said that you were able to do that on your own, but that the civil service has changed since then, and so somebody of your grade as head of blood policy wouldn't now be able to make that decision.
Rarely, I think, these days.
What I've been asked to ask you, why has that changed, or what has changed about the decision-making process?
This is something that goes back really to probably around 2006. 2007, when there was another of the periodic reorganisations at the Department of Health. And I think for the sake of consistency, again, in the way in which issues were brought to ministers' attention, there was a rule that everything essentially had to go through at branch head level before going to ministers, or if not more senior.
In relation to the questions I asked you about the submission that you did for Alan Milburn following his telephone conversation with Malcolm Chisholm about the Scottish compensation scheme, what was your primary concern at that stage? Was it whether there was a devolved power, or was it the ability to thoroughly debate the immediate impact of any such scheme on the other UK countries and the wider implications for the handling of future compensation claims? In other words, did the department truly consider this to be an issue of devolution, reserved competency, or was it more the case of political inexpediency for Westminster more generally, in light of the position taken by that government over the years?
I mean, from my point of view, my aim was to address the issue of whether there was a devolved power, which is what the Secretary of State had asked for, and which had been the subject of his discussion with Malcolm Chisholm. I didn't think about it beyond that, personally, though the more political consideration would have been for ministers.
Was it Malcolm Chisholm's concern as to whether instituting a hepatitis C payment scheme was a devolved matter that set the devolution question in train, as far as you're aware?
Yes, as far as I'm aware, the question came to me following Alan Milburn's discussion with Malcolm Chisholm, in which Malcolm Chisholm, I mean, again, I had all this relayed to me third hand, bear in mind, at which Malcolm Chisholm said he wasn't sure himself what the devolved powers were. I think we've got to remember that the Scottish devolution for Scotland had only happened a year or two previously. So this was very, very new, and I think everybody was probably still finding their way on this.
Can I just ask you this? The impression which you have given me by reference to the documents, let it be said, earlier in your evidence was this, that the ministers in London, ministers of the UK government, were determined to hold a line against extending compensation to those who had suffered hepatitis infection through blood transfusion. Ministers in Scotland rather wanted there to be a form of payment for those who had suffered in that way. And so you have the ministers in London not wanting to be bounced as might inevitably happen if Scotland went alone into doing what they didn't really want to do but might have to do in response to public opinion. And one way of the ministers might have been looking for ways in which they could at least have a debate with Scotland to see if they could persuade them to do otherwise or to stop what they thought was an undesirable development, and so looked for a possible solution, which was it within devolution powers? If Scotland had wanted to do what England would also have wanted to do, devolution wouldn't have come into it, would it?
No, I mean, it only arose because Scotland was considering doing something different from England, and so the political issue, as you say, was that there was no longer a consensus, and the note that I wrote based on what I'd been told is Alan Milburn telling Malcolm Chisholm to tough it out.
So I've understood it correctly, have I?
I think you have, yes.
Thank you.
I took you to some correspondence where you sought advice on the repercussions for England if there was a Scottish-only inquiry. Can you recall the extent to which that matter was being raised by your counterpart in Scotland, Mr. Stock?
I can't, again. I mean, I raised the issue because I wanted to understand legally what the UK's position would be in the event of a Scottish inquiry, which would inevitably touch on decisions made by the Department of Health in London. So it was my concern to sort of understand that legal position as part of my role and the need to advise ministers if necessary.
And do you recall having any discussion with the Scottish Executive representatives, Mr. Stock or others, about that issue?
I don't, I'm afraid.
I'm going to ask you now some questions about the GEB or ACVSB files, as we've been calling them.
Yes.
First of all, do you? We've been talking about the GEB files. Do you know what was in the GEB files that were destroyed?
I do not, because I cover this in my statement because I wasn't involved at the point at which those documents were produced. I'm unable to say what wasn't there.
When you recall a file, a paper file,
Mm-hmm.
so from in the time we're talking about, the late 1980s, early 1990s, a file that's gone off to the Records Office, and you recall it back to your desk to have a look at, where is the document destruction label on the file? So the date with the review on it.
From memory, the front of these files had a section in which you could put a review date and or a destruction date. So it was on the, if you think of this as essentially a paper file, on the front cover there was something printed which enabled you to put that information on.
So if you were looking at a file that had come back from the Records Office and there was a document destruction date on it, it would be very clear to the person looking at that file when the document destruction date was.
Yes, I think so.
Can I ask you to look at, please, WITN 6955040. So this is an email sent from you to Lawrence George. Lawrence George was one of the investigators, is that right?
That's
of
correct.
The internal audit. And if we go down to the bottom of, you say there, this is the information we got from FileStore on when the ACVSB papers were destroyed. And then if we go down to the bottom, we can see it says DRO file requests, and then it sets out a number of file references from the GEB series 1, volumes 4 destroyed in 1994, Vol S, do you know what that
I
signifies?
don't know what the S signifies, no.
5, 6, 7, 8, 11, 12, 14 in 1997, S 9, 10, 13 destroyed in 1998, 15 destroyed in 1996, and 16 destroyed in 1997. Is that the information that you had about the GEB file destruction dates from the Records Office?
It is. The S, I think it's a typo. It's volumes. I think that's all it means. Yes, that's certainly the information that Anne on my team obtained, then passed on to me, and then I passed on to the audit people. Now,
I asked you some questions about whether or not you knew the name of the person that had ordered the destruction of the files. And you said you couldn't remember now, and if you'd ever known, you couldn't now remember. Can I ask you to turn, can we look at WITN 695 5061? This is a document called Charles Lister Interview, and it's extremely difficult to read.
Yes.
But is it right to understand that this is a handwritten note from one of the investigators carrying out the audit of what happened to the files?
I believe so. I hadn't seen it before it was disclosed, but that's certainly what it looks like. I also found it very difficult to read.
Now, if we look halfway down the page, it says who destroyed, and then underline it says dockets. And then it says something first, something not destroyed.
Later ones were.
Later ones were. And then it says John Rutherford, or Rutherlord, Intel on docket. Did not something telephoned? Did not remember. Telephoned? Not directly to something. Does that ring any bells with you?
I'm afraid not. And it is very hard to interpret what it means.
Do you know who, does the name John Rutherford or Rutherlord ring any bells with you?
No, it doesn't. I assume that, I mean, again, this is an assumption on my part, that the docket would be a record that the file office kept. If a file was destroyed, they would have a little piece of paper that they kept that indicated when it was destroyed. That's probably what the docket was, but I don't know.
Now, we don't have this on the system today. It's not a document that Mr. Lister has been shown, but I'm just going to read this reference into the transcript. It's a document that Ms. Richards took Dr. Raymond to during his evidence, and it's the docket, I believe, on the GEB4 file, which sets out the information, the docket destruction sticker, if I can describe it in that way. The docket, and it's WITN 4486013. As I say, I can't show it on the screen, and I haven't shown it in any event to Mr. Lister in advance, but there are initials there, and so you may wish to have a look at those initials and see whether they may say JR or not.
Yes, thank you.
In your second witness statement, I don't think we need to go to it necessarily, but you suggest that the identity of at least one of the people employed in the destruction of the GEB files may have had a small holding. you able to
That
give us any more
that was
information?
something that Anita James commented on,
Right, so
and I think after my time,
so we can pick that up with her.
yes.
And I think the last question that I'm going to ask you then from call participants is in relation to Ms. De Sampaio. You told us that you didn't speak to her. Do you know, other than within the audit investigation, do you know whether any other Department of Health officials spoke to her or got a written statement from her about what had happened?
I do not.
Just look behind me. No, no, I'm not going to ask any more questions from call participants. I believe Mr. Moss doesn't have any questions. So do you have any questions?
Yes, I do. It's really arises from what you were saying in something of a side remark when you were speculating about the circumstances of destruction, and you were being asked about the question of witch hunt and blame. You said, well, perhaps, or you thought, that perhaps rather more senior managers than the junior people who did the act of destruction might be, in inverted commas, to blame. What gave rise to that speculation?
I think more by failing to supervise a decision on destruction of documents properly.
Now, if they were, let us suppose, failing in that responsibility, I can understand that at least the logic, people may argue one way or the other about it, and I have to make my mind up about junior staff not being blamed so that lessons can be learned for the future. But wouldn't it be important to know that senior staff, who may therefore be moving on in the civil service, are wanting in fulfilling their important responsibilities?
Certainly that's, I can't disagree with that. I mean, one of the things that the audit recommended was that the supervision should be conducted at a more senior level.
Yes.
Than it had been. And I think that's partly in recognition that if documents are to be destroyed, then it needs the sign-off by somebody who understands the implications of doing so.
And going back to the question of the junior member of staff, now, it has been rather assumed that the documents destroyed in 1996, 1997, 1998 were all destroyed by one and the same person. Was that your general understanding?
That was my understanding, but I can't, at this point, swear to that, I'm afraid.
So it would follow that some junior member of staff had, if you're right, and if the understanding you were given, because you didn't yourself see it and you didn't yourself investigate it, but if that's right, would it follow that somebody who sees on the face of a document that there is a review date which has not yet been passed has taken a decision to destroy that document and then come back to destroy another either group of documents or documents at different times on no less than 3 or 4 occasions?
Yeah, I think it does go back to that question of why those particular dates were chosen. Was this something that was done on one occasion with a sequence of dates? So again, a speculation on my part, but if I recollect rightly, the guidance included something that suggested that if the last document in the file was older than 5 years, I can't remember exactly what it was, then that file could be considered for destruction. But that, of course, doesn't take account of the content of the file and the importance of it. And again, in speculating, I guess it is possible that this person saw these sequence of files, all of which hadn't been added to for a while, and put a destruct date on 5 years after the last document to appear on the file, and did that all at the same time.
It would be really quite important, would it not, in working out how to stop this happening again, when your plain view is that this simply should not have happened, to know why the member of staff, assuming it to be the same person, on each of these occasions, had done it and done it repeatedly, presumably thinking, well, one doesn't know because one hasn't asked him.
No.
So what was in his mind, or her mind?
Yes.
And without knowing the reasons for the destruction, one wouldn't be able to apportion blame if blame was then to be considered. And isn't there perhaps a structured approach that one should look first of all at why something happened and then say, well, is there blame to be apportioned here? Should we apportion blame?
I think this does then go to the question of whether the audit properly addressed the issue, as it didn't look at those things.
Yes. So the conclusion might be that the audit was lacking.
Yes, it might be.
Thank you. That's all that I ask.
So I'm afraid we don't have the dockets on the system, but I'm being told that there are 3 different signatures on the various dockets.
Ah,
Very well. In that case, the information that was given was misleading, and the same question then arises as to why 3 separate people, if they're assuming there were 3 separate people, did essentially the same action in respect to files in the same policy area, in the same department, in the times that they did.
yes, I'd be curious to know if I recognised any of the names, but presumably you're not able to say.
They're not documents that were provided to you, and we don't
Right.
have them on the system. But yes, there's no reason why we can't provide them to you. And
I don't know if there's a further question that arises out of that.
no, so there isn't. Do you have anything that you would like to say?
I don't. I think I attempted to provide as thorough a set of written statements as possible, and I just hope that they are helpful to the inquiry.
Well, thank you for giving evidence which has certainly been engaging. It's been a real value having the insight of an insider over many years into the workings of the civil service and the interactions with ministers and how perhaps decisions are formed, helping us to understand that. And there may have been, as I called it earlier, speculation at some stages. That's perhaps inevitable with passing of time, but to us, it has the value of being the speculation of an insider. So thank you for that.
So tomorrow we have the evidence of Mr. Fenwick, QC.
Yes. So Justin Fenwick, QC, tomorrow at 10 o'clock.